What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Draft Season Never Ends, the Aftermath NFL Draft podcast. I am Chris McGlynn, and the NFL Draft is officially in the books for 2022. It was a wild couple of days, and I'm here to break it down on a special Monday episode of the podcast with the draft. My goodness, there's so much to take away from this past weekend. It was a ton of fun. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And yeah, had a great time tweeting about it, watching the coverage all 3 days. Just so many interesting moves, and we're going to get into some of that right here. Before we get into really the meat of it, I want to just give a quick shout out to the winner of the first ever Aftermath NFL Draft contest, and that is the entry under the name of Rollerblade. So I already reached out to this person, contacted them to let them know that they've won. I'm just waiting for confirmation there that they actually received the email and all of that. But they actually got every single prop bet right, which was really impressive considering the fact that we had a couple of them that definitely went in some unexpected directions, all of the chaos that happened in the first and second rounds of the draft. So congratulations to Rollerblade. You have won a free 1-year subscription to ESPN Plus. I'm also going to be announcing the winners of the second and third prizes as well. I'll probably have that figured out by the Friday show, so make sure you keep an eye out for that. But really excited. Thank you to everybody who participated. It was a ton of fun. I really enjoyed it. Most of you, I made my own, kind of entry just to see. I wasn't obviously part of the contest, but wanted to see how I stacked up. And I did okay, but a lot of the people who entered beat me, so I'll have to do better next year, but a ton of fun, and I really appreciate everybody who participated in the contest. So with all of that in mind, let's dive into this. I'm going to go through who I think some of the teams that had the best drafts, some of the teams that had probably the worst drafts, and then I'm also going to talk about some of my favorite mid and late round picks from this 2022 class. Let's start with our best drafts here, and as if you listen to this podcast, you've talked to me about this before. I am always I'm a bit hesitant to put a grade on a draft class immediately after it happens, right? We don't know what any of these players are going to do in the NFL level quite yet. We haven't seen any of them play. We don't really know anything about them. We hope that these teams crushed it, right? We think they did. I certainly feel that way about how a couple of different teams drafted here, but we won't really know for a couple of years. So with that in mind, I will be grading the 2017 draft class now because it's a 5-year window. That's what I always look at. So we're 5 years removed from that. So I'll be regrading that at some point in a couple of days. You can keep an eye out for that on aftermathsports.com. I'll be putting out tons of content related to the draft, all sorts of different things like that. So make sure you check out the website. But let's dive into this. So I'm going to start with the Green Bay Packers, and I think initially people were kind of getting ready to kill them for not getting a receiver in the first round. I know that they needed somebody to help replace Davante Adams. There's no question about that. The truth is, though, is I don't know that there's anybody in this draft class who's going to be able to replace Davante Adams, given what he was and what he meant from a value perspective to the Green Bay Packers. So they went out and they drafted 2 really good defensive prospects from Georgia who I think are going to really make an immediate impact on that team. And then they went and they traded up in the second round. They got Christian Watson, who I think has the potential to be one of the better receivers in this class. He's got to definitely work on some stuff with his catching away from his body and stuff like that. But I think he even showed some improvement at the Senior Bowl relative to where he had been throughout the most of his season with North Dakota State. So I think he's big body receiver, somebody Aaron Rodgers is going to like to work with. And I wouldn't be surprised either if they continue to go maybe the veteran route, bring somebody in who's currently a free agent, whether that's a Jarvis Landry, an Odell Beckham Jr., a T.Y. Hilton perhaps. So there's some guys that are currently out there that could still be productive NFL receivers the Packers can target. Then they continue to address some needs. They got Sean Ryan in the third round, who a player that I really like, and I think actually fills some important depth for them and potentially even a starter role for them this upcoming season. Their offensive line has struggled with injuries the last couple of years. Then they got Romeo Doubs, a wide receiver out of Nevada, another developmental guy for them to bring in and hopefully bring along. The Packers actually have a pretty decent track record of finding these mid-round players and turning them into productive NFL-level starters. We talked about Alan Lazard. You could look at Marquez Valdez-Scantling. Greg Jennings was very much like this back in the day. Jordy Nelson was not a first-round pick. Most of the players that Aaron Rodgers has thrown the ball to throughout his career have not been first-round picks. And a lot of that is because the Packers do a good job of developing them in-house and setting them up for success down the line. So overall, I think the Packers had a really good draft. Grabbed a couple of more players a couple shots on some players down the stretch here, like a Rasheed Walker out of Penn State, who I think going into the year, there was a little hype that he could be a pretty good player. He struggled a bit, and I think there's some clear spots on film that he needs to improve. But, I mean, the physical frame is there that if he can figure it out, this could end up being a really good value pick for the Packers, maybe a swing tackle this upcoming season for them. So overall, I think the Packers had a really strong draft. I think they got better for this year and for the future, which is usually something that you hope you could say walking out of a draft class. And I don't think that every team can say that after this draft. All right, let's move on next to the Philadelphia Eagles, who just, Howie Roseman, take a bow, fantastic job navigating the draft board, executing trades, and just really figuring out a way to bring in some instant impact players, address future needs, and make this team better. Because the truth is that the Eagles traded up in the first round. They only moved up 2 spots, but they took Jordan Davis. Now, Jordan Davis is probably going to be a 2-down run stopper to begin his career. You don't even really need him to be on the field all that much because you still have Javon Hargrave and Fletcher Cox. Well, the thing is, both those guys are in contract years. So next year, when they're both gone, now you've already got the replacement in-house, and Jordan Davis is somebody who can contribute right away in run, short yardage situations, goal line sets, whatever it might be. Get him in there, rotating in. I guarantee you will see him on the field in a more limited capacity, probably as a rookie, as before he takes a larger role in his second year in the league. And then you went out, you got A.J. Brown for a first-round pick and a third-round pick, which was just a great addition to that offense. You had to pay him, obviously, which is unfortunate, but you're putting Jalen Hurts now in a position where he is going to have to be successful if he wants to keep this job. There's no more excuses. The offensive line looks really solid. You already had Devonta Smith. Now you go out, you get A.J. Brown. You already have Dallas Goedert there, too. A solid running back group led by Miles Sanders. I mean, there's a lot there that you like about how this group is shaping up. Now it's up to Jalen Hurts. He's got to get it done. Then you go out and you grab a player that everybody was shocked slid as far as he did in Nakobe Dean, which I just thought was outrageous that he fell that far. There was injury concerns reportedly regarding him with a pectoral muscle. He also had some knee injuries in college. So there's definitely some red flags there. But if he ends up panning out to be the player that everybody expected him to be, what you saw on film, I mean, this is a steal for the Eagles in the third round. Overall, just a really strong draft for them. I think they got better, like I said, immediately. They improved their long-term prospects as well. You find guys who are going to be able to step in down the line and make impacts on this team. And in a division that's not that strong to begin with, I think the Dallas Cowboys had a solid draft, but, I mean, the Eagles might have put themselves in the driver's seat in this division, and I don't think that's that ridiculous of a statement when you look at what they did and what they already had. Overall, I mean, they didn't have a ton of draft picks here, but I think just how they approached the draft as a whole, it looks like they put themselves in a really strong position to be successful this upcoming year. Let's move along now. My next team on here is going to be the Baltimore Ravens. And I think this is a pretty obvious one. Most people you've read, if you've seen any of the reaction and stuff like that, the Ravens had a fantastic draft. Now, there are some things to iron out still, as I talked about on Friday in my last podcast episode, reacting to round 1. It seems like Lamar Jackson's pretty unhappy that Marquise Brown left, but it doesn't seem like he's unhappy with the team, which I think is important to clarify here. The report is that Eric DeCosta, the GM of the Ravens, did let Lamar know that they were going to be trading away Marquise Brown, and they did a fantastic job netting a first-round pick for a guy that I don't even know if is a true wide receiver 1. I mean, I think he fits what they want to do schematically in Arizona, but I think that's really good value the Ravens got for a player that has been frustratingly inconsistent for the Ravens throughout the course of his time with the team. So, anyway, I think they're going to be okay. The one knock on this draft class is that they didn't take a receiver, which I think is kind of odd. But they have actually spent a lot of mid-round picks on receivers in the last couple of years. They took Devin Duvernay and Tylan Wallace. and James Prochet, all in the middle to late rounds of the last 3 drafts. So I think they're counting on one of those guys finally taking that next step in their development and becoming a more productive player in this offense. There's also veterans out there, similar to what I talked about the Packers. There's probably going to be a veteran receiver brought in here, whether it's an Odell Beckham Jr. or, like I said, T.Y. Hilton, Jarvis Landry. There's more out there as well. There's going to be a veteran player most likely brought in to hopefully help bolster this receiver core this year. Getting a first round pick for a player that you probably weren't going to pay a year from now, I think is a really good move and something that the Ravens have to feel really good about. Let's get to the actual draft for them, because they came away with an impact player immediately in Kyle Hamilton, who, some people were saying he was the top prospect in this draft. I had a top 10 grade on him. I don't know if he was as good as people maybe were making him out to be, but at the same time, you could deploy him in a number of different ways. Very versatile player. I like the fit a lot for Baltimore. And it's going to be interesting to see how they use him, because I think they're going to get pretty creative with how they deploy him on the field. And then at the back end of the first round, they then picked up Tyler Linderbaum, who I think is the best center clearly in this draft. A great scheme fit for what Baltimore wants to do. Somebody who's able to, I think with the athletic ability that he displays on tape, able to get out there, block on the perimeter for running backs, pull, whatever you want, screens, you name it. He's got that athleticism. Yes, there's the shorter arms, shorter than average arms, a little underweight as well. Hopefully he can add a little more weight, make it a little harder for him to get pushed around in the NFL. But we'll see. I think he's going to be somebody that's going to end up having a successful NFL career. There obviously are a couple of question marks, though, when it comes to the physical ability, not abilities, but the measurables, I think is the best way to describe it, measurables with Linderbaum. You keep going down. David Ojabo in the second round could end up being a steal there. He was a top 15 player before he tore his Achilles. Now you essentially give him a year to redshirt there. The Ravens have done a fantastic job over the years of developing pass rushers and turning them into players that are able to contribute on a regular basis. They already took Odafe Owe last year in the first round. I think pairing him with Ojabo is just going to be a nightmare, whatever Ojabo is able to get healthy and get back on the field. My goodness, those are two just athletic, unbelievable pass rushers with the just sky-high potential to reach. It's going to be a little bit slow going at first, I think, for Ojabo, even once he is able to get back on the field. There was some learning curve for him, right? Regardless of the injury or not. There's definitely some elements of his game. He's pretty raw still when it comes to rushing the passer, but the upside is incredible. The physical testing, all that type of stuff is stuff that you love to see. And overall, this is just unbelievable the Ravens were able to score him in the second round. And then you went out and got Travis Jones in the third round, who I think was probably one of the better defensive tackles in this draft. Somebody that I think is going to be able to come in and potentially be a day one starter for the Ravens. Great value for them. I love the pick. And overall, seriously, just an impressive draft from the Ravens. They ended up with 6 fourth-round picks as well, really working hard to fill out their roster. They did draft a punter, which I get they wanted to get younger punter. Again, it would have been great to see them grab a receiver. That really would have put it over the top for me. Maybe if they grabbed, I've seen people really upset that they didn't take a Calvin Austin wide receiver from Memphis, who's just got that speed to kind of take the top off for the offense and all of that. But overall, you really can't fault the Ravens for how they handled all of this. They do have steps left to move here, and they need to make sure they're putting as much talent around Lamar Jackson as possible. They did draft 2 more tight ends, 2 guys that I liked as well in this class. So I expect to see a lot of 2 tight end or maybe even some 3 tight end sets for the Ravens this upcoming fall. We'll see how it all goes. Last one that I'm going to shout out here for having a really strong draft, and I feel very conflicted doing this, but I think the New York Jets actually had a really good draft. For those who are unaware, I am a Jets fan. I love Gangrene, and it's been a really rough, kind of just disappointing, painful, even past decade with this team. We've been here before, where people say, oh, the Jets walked out with the best player in the draft, whether that was Leonard Williams or Jamal Adams, or, Sam Darnold, people were saying was the best pick in the draft. They were shocked the Jets got him at 3. Well, none of those guys ended up working out. All 3 of them actually traded by the team. So at least they got something for him. Thank you, Jamal Adams, for the trade that netted them all these extra picks in the past couple of years. It's allowed them to restock. But, I'm cautiously optimistic. I want to be really excited for the Jets. but I've been here before. I've seen this team. I've been optimistic and then been let down. So I'm trying to keep my expectations in check. This team is still very young and still very far away from genuinely competing for a title, but I think they're at least putting the right building blocks in place to be successful. I mean, and that starts with the picks they made in the first round. They went out, they took Sauce Gardner, who is my number 2 player in this draft overall, my favorite corner prospect by far. I mean, just long, athletic, fast, physical, you name it. He checks all those boxes. Just a dominant player at Cincinnati. I really like what I saw from him, and I think he's going to be a great fit in Robert Saleh's defense. Then they take Garrett Wilson, who is just this smooth operator in space for the offense. They haven't had a true number 1 wide receiver in a few years now, and I think this actually gives them a pretty solid receiver core. Again, maybe Wilson is not quite there yet where you feel like he's going to be an elite playmaker, but I think the potential is there given the physical traits for him to become that down the line. And then they went and traded back into the first round Turk Jermaine Johnson II, who I had a top 10 grade on. I think this is, to me, best run defending edge player in this draft. Just so pro ready from that perspective. Had a lot of production from a pass rushing standpoint. 11.5 sacks this year. He is kind of a one-year wonder right now. At least that's how a lot of teams were viewing him, because he spent 2 years at junior college, didn't really do much at Georgia, transferred to Florida State, and had a fantastic year. But he was already a redshirt senior, so he's one of the older prospects in this draft class. So yes, I think he's going to be a great pick. I just think maybe people have to temper the expectations a little bit on what the immediate impact is going to be from him, at least from a pass rushing perspective, because while he's creative with what he doesn't always consistently win. His pass rush win rate, that's tough to say, was pretty down this year. It was not fantastic. I think he benefited a lot from playing. There were some really bad offensive lines in the ACC this year, particularly you look at Miami, Syracuse, and maybe even Louisville at times, just not great offensive lines. So I think there is definitely some of that you need to take into account here. But at the same time, if this is a spot where you take a shot at this type of guy, he's going to be at least a 2-down player in the NFL, bare minimum. And I think that's the thing here, is the floor for him is a very productive guy with the potential to become a pass rusher, to become an elite pass rusher when you look at the physical tools he brings to the table. He's got some room to grow there, but overall, I love the player, and I think this is going to be a great fit. I mean, to me, the Jets got 3 top 12 players in the first round, and then they traded up a couple spots in the second round and took Breece Hall, which people might be a little surprised by because they had Michael Carter, who did a really nice job last year for them. But Carter is more of a change of pace back, and now Breece Hall gives them a true number 1 running back here, and I think somebody they're going to feel really comfortable playing in this Mike Shanahan type of, Kyle Shanahan type of offense. You've got Mike LaFleur there, the offensive coordinator previously with the 49ers under Kyle Shanahan there. So I think they want to see, you look at what Green Bay does, right? You've got 2 running backs there that are able to kind of carry the load for them. Now the Jets have that type of setup as well. You've got Breece Hall, who's, man, he tested great. He ran a sub-4 440. He caught over 80 passes in his career out of the backfield. Put up a ton of production in college. I think he's going to be somebody that actually ends up having a really successful career in the NFL. Maybe he's not quite to the same level as what we see from like a Jonathan Taylor, right? Or Derrick Henry or something like that. But I think he could end up being somebody the Jets get a lot of production out of for the next 4 years, and maybe even earns a second contract in the NFL, which is particularly hard to do these days. A lucrative second contract, I should say, in the NFL for a running back, because that is not easy to do these days. The Jets right out of their draft, they took a couple of players later on. Jeremy Ruckert was a little bit of a surprise, 3rd-round tight end out of Ohio State, only because they signed C.J. Uzomah and Tyler Conklin this past year. It should say this offseason. So it was a little bit of a surprise to see them take a tight end there, but honestly, I don't mind it. And then they went out and they drafted Max Mitchell in the 4th round, who I think has the potential to be potentially an inside starter for them down the line. We'll see what ends up happening there. Maybe right guard. There are some question marks about the long-term prospects for that position. And they took Michael Clemens, a player who has some checkered history, especially when it comes off the field, but looked pretty solid as a pass rusher at Texas A&M. And at the very least, I think could be a situational player, a role player for them down the line coming on that defensive line. I'm really excited about the Jets. I think they had a great draft. I am nervous, obviously, because I've been here before, but I'm trying to just let myself enjoy this. It's hard to do. It's very weird. Talking with some different people this past week, you're scarred, and I am. I'm scarred by this. I've seen this happen before, and I just really hope it works out this time. Let's go to the negative side of all of this because while it'd be great to praise everybody and say everybody had a great draft, that's not really the case. There were definitely some interesting drafts here. I think there's no place to start here other than New England Patriots because I don't really know what the Patriots were doing because they took Cole Strange in the first round, and I like the player a lot. It seemed a little bit early for him. I was a bit surprised that they decided to make the pick here. Thought maybe they could have traded down into the second round and still taken him. So definitely a little surprising there. But then they went a step further on Friday and they took Tyquan Thornton in the second round out of Baylor. And it's not that I don't like Thornton as a prospect, but when you look at all the other players that were on the board still there for New England, especially at wide receiver, it's a bit of a shock to see them take this guy. George Pickens is still there. Sky Moore is still there. I think Alec Pierce might have even still been on the board at this point out of Cincinnati. So there were quite a few receivers there that you felt like, oh, okay, like that maybe wasn't the best use of that pick. A guy that people were talking about having a late day two, early day three grade on. And yeah, I mean, he didn't crack my top 100 prospects, so taking him in the second round was definitely a bit of a shock for me there. And then day three might have been the most confusing of all because they took it a step further and they drafted 2 running backs and a quarterback in the 4th and 5th round, which I cannot figure out. The Patriots already have a ton of running backs on their roster. Damian Harris, they drafted Ramondre Stevenson last year. They still have James White under contract. J.J. Taylor is still there. Now you draft 2 more running backs, and a guy I like a lot in Pierre Strong Jr. out of South Dakota State. But it was a little surprising to see that. Maybe this means that James White's time is coming to an end with the team. But then they drafted a quarterback in Bailey Zappi out of Western Kentucky. And for those who maybe don't know Bailey Zappi super well, he's broke a ton of records, broke a lot of Joe Burrow's records, actually, this past season, playing at Western Kentucky. But it was his first season playing in FBS football. He was previously an FCS player, I believe, at Houston Baptist. So this is a big step up. He played in an air raid system, and he doesn't really have the physical traits that you would associate with a future franchise quarterback. This isn't a guy that you look at and say, oh, well, he's got elite arm strength, and maybe he's just going to work on the technical side a little bit. Now, maybe the Patriots feel that they found themselves a really high-end backup here, somebody who's intelligent and really capable of being a spot starter if needed, if Mac Jones happens to go down. It's just a bit odd to me to see them spend a draft pick to try and address that position. Bill Belichick typically likes to go out and find players who are able to step in as veterans and be in that role, whether it's Brian Hoyer or Jacoby Brissett previously. I mean, they've had a good track record of developing some guys. Obviously, Jimmy Garoppolo came out of there. Brissett did as well, where they took them in, they drafted them, developed them. They were able to flip them for draft picks down the line. I'm just a little surprised to see them take a quarterback 1 year after taking Mac Jones. Now, it's a 4th round pick. I don't think we need to read too much into it, but a quarterback and 2 running backs in the 4th round just felt like a really weird approach for the Patriots there. I don't know. It just, again, one that left you kind of scratching your head a bit when you look at some of their needs. You needed a corner, you lost interior linemen, and instead you're taking, I don't know, you didn't really address the positions of need that I think on this team. Maybe depth at linebacker would have been a good spot to try and find there. I don't know. We'll see. The likelihood is that Belichick will turn one of these players into like an all-pro because that just seems to be what ends up happening with the Patriots. But I don't know. It just feels to me like this was a really weird draft that could have gone a lot better for them. And they reached in a couple different spots. And that's not just me saying that. I think the general consensus has been like, wow, the league is pretty surprised by what the Patriots did. Nobody had these players graded as high as Bill Belichick and that front office staff seemed to have going into this draft process. I'm going to move into another one here, and this is the Washington Commanders. I don't hate what Washington did, but in a similar way, I feel like they made some interesting choices here that led me to wonder a little bit about what their draft would look like compared to the rest of the league. Let's start with their first round pick, and that was Jahan Dotson. I talked about this a little bit on Friday because I think Dotson's a good player, but I think this was just a bit early for him, especially when you look at a guy like Treylon Burks still being on the board for him, at that point. I think he was the better prospect. And Dotson, to me, is probably a slot receiver in the NFL. I don't know that he has the size to be able to compete on the outside. I could be wrong, could be totally wrong on this one, but he weighs south of 180 pounds. And I just worry about him really being able to stand up the pounding that comes in the NFL, especially for the receivers when they go across the middle, they catch these balls and they sometimes get laid out. It's a tough spot. I know the NFL has really stepped up in recent years of trying to minimize the amount of injuries that come for these blindside hits or these, whatever, the backside, the blocks that end up getting hit with these guys. But on the whole, yeah, I wonder a little bit about this draft class because after Dotson, they took Fedarian Mathis, who I like a lot as a player, but Washington has a really good defensive line with some depth there as well. So I was a bit surprised to see them take a defensive tackle in the second round and then take a running back in the third round when they've already got a guy like Antonio Gibson and I believe Jerick McKinnon is still there as well. He was supposed to go to Buffalo, ended up coming back and playing with them still in Washington. So a bit of a surprise. You needed a player on the back end, I thought, and they didn't take Percy Butler until the fourth round. So I'm surprised they didn't take a corner or safety prior to this point. They didn't take a corner until the seventh round. It just was a weird draft for me. It seemed like the priorities were a little bit out of order here. Maybe they truly were just going best player available based on what their board said. But I don't know. It just felt a little bit weird. The one thing that I do really like that they did was taking Sam Howell to start the fifth round. I think Sam Howell is somebody that could develop into an NFL starter. There obviously are some things that he needs to work on when it comes to just developing from going through his reads, reading defenses, understanding progressions and stuff like that perspective. You watch him on film, it doesn't seem like he does a ton of that. Did a ton of that, I should say, at UNC. That being said, though, Carson Wentz is essentially in a contract year, as weird as it sounds. He's under contract for 3 more years, but there's no more guaranteed money on his deal after this year. So if the Washington Commanders want to, they can get out of Carson Wentz's contract after this year with 0 dead money. So that's a huge thing. So I wonder a little bit, could Sam Howell possibly be the starting quarterback for the Commanders in 2023? I wrote about this on AftermathSports.com, and I'm wondering if that's a real possibility because I would not be shocked if Carson Wentz is gone, if he's not able to produce at the level that we saw from him in Philadelphia prior to that injury. If he looks like the player we saw in Indianapolis last year, I think he's done. And I think Washington is going to be more than willing to cut ties and save over $26 million in cap space going forward and turn things over to Sam Howell. Just my 2 cents on that. I don't obviously know. I don't have any inside knowledge of that, but just taking a look at how this is all possibly coming out and playing out here, it wouldn't be a shock to me to see Sam Howell starting for the Commanders in 2023. One last draft that I want to talk about here that I thought was maybe a little bit underwhelming, and that was the Jacksonville Jaguars. And it's hard to fault them because they took a high upside player at number 1 overall in Siobhan Walker. I personally had a couple different players ranked ahead of Walker. I think there's a lot of projection that comes there. The physical traits are amazing, right? We've seen that, and the versatility is incredible. But I think when you look at a player like Aiden Hutchinson, who's so pro-ready, just ready to go out there, potentially be an 8 to 10 sack a year guy from the get-go. Even Kevon Thibodeau, where you look at some of the physical traits there, and I wonder if maybe he would have even been a better pick at this spot. I advocated for a long time for them to take Evan Neal at number 1. That was up until they signed Cam Robinson long-term. Now, I don't love Cam Robinson as a player in the NFL. I think he's an okay tackle, but I think Evan Neal would have been a major upgrade. Instead, they decided to lock up Cam Robinson here and keep him on. It was a bit of an odd decision to me, and I don't love it overall, but they did what they did, and they took a high-end player there. Then let's move a little further here. They traded into the first round, back into the first round, I should say, to take Devin Lloyd, who's one of my favorite prospects. I love Devin Lloyd. I think he's a great fit here. But then they went in the third round and drafted Chad Mumma out of Wyoming. And this was a bit of a surprise to me because they just spent a ton of money to bring in They just spent a ton of money this offseason at the linebacker position. So why are you drafting 2 linebackers in the first 3 rounds here? That one just felt like a bit odd to me. Maybe not the best use of your picks and your draft capital, especially when you've got a young team that's developing and you kind of have a bunch of holes all over the roster. They also spent a 3rd-round pick on Luke Fortner to potentially come in and play center after they lost their center this past offseason. I don't know that Fortner is all that pro-ready, to be honest with you. I think he's a little more of a project here. Took a running back in the 5th round and Snoop Connor, even though you have James Robinson and Travis Etienne already under contract. I mean, hey, maybe some depth there is not a bad idea. I don't know. It just is one of those things where I felt like they picked some really interesting position groups to attack and target here. And while I don't necessarily hate the draft, it just didn't feel like maybe they approached it the best way they could have. And I worry that maybe Jacksonville's really not going to be that much better this year. Now, I'm hoping that just the fact that they have Doug Peterson in place means that they're going to be better positioned for success this year. I would be really surprised if they end up picking number one overall again next year, but it's a real possibility. I mean, this team is still desperately lacking talent. I don't think that they really made any moves this offseason that you look at, other than Brandon Sheriff at guard, that you look at and say, oh, well, they clearly upgraded the position. You paid a ton to get Christian Kirk, who is good, but maybe not great. And you spent a ton at linebacker, off-ball linebacker, which is a position the NFL continues to slowly devalue, I think. So, yeah, I wonder a little bit about Jacksonville here. I didn't love their draft. I think there was definitely some different directions they could have gone here. Like I said, there are some players I really like. Getting Walker and Lloyd in the first round, great. The rest of the draft was a little confusing to me, even if, like I said, Fortner does fill a position of need, but maybe not the best way to go about it. Maybe you could have found a veteran center there. Maybe they will. Maybe they will find a veteran center to start this year and let Fortner come along and be the starter maybe down the line. I'm not really sure. But I just didn't love what Jacksonville did here. I have some more questions about what they did in this draft class than I do answers. But anyway, those are the three that I wanted to touch on there. I think those are some teams that maybe if they had a do-over, they might take things a little bit differently here. Now, again, as I said, only time will tell. We have no idea right now how these draft classes are going to pan out. This is what my initial thought is after looking at how these players went, players that were still on the board, that type of thing. We won't really know for 4 or 5 years. Heck, we might not even know then. I remember I did a redraft at one point for the 2013 draft class, and I had Le'Veon Bell as like a potential top 5 pick. Well, that looks pretty foolish right about now when you consider how Le'Veon Bell's career ended. When you look at what he did in his first 5 seasons, though, it seemed like that was an obvious pick. So you never know. Like sometimes the careers take weird turns, all that type of stuff. And I think, yeah, that might speak a little bit more about just how much volatility there is at the running back position and why you don't pay running backs in the NFL anymore. But at the same time, I just think it's a really good reminder that we don't know what's going to happen. We might not for a really long time. So try and be patient. Realize that sometimes the first year after a draft class is done is not even a really good time to grade it and react. Right? We don't know. Sometimes you feel like you have a great draft class after a year, and then a couple of players, it's like, oh, well, they kind of peaked. That was it. And you never really get that same level of production out of them again. Point is, give it time. We'll see. These are my initial reactions. Don't come at me in 2 years and be like, you said that this was a terrible pick. Yeah, at the time I might have thought so. And it might be just that, like, looking at who was on the board, I thought that would have been a better prospect to pick. Could be very wrong. We'll see. I have no idea. Maybe Tyquan Thornton's going to end up being a Hall of Fame receiver for the Patriots. I don't really know. That's the point of all of this. Nobody really knows. It's just what you hope, what your initial reaction is, and we'll go from there. Let's move on now into some of my favorite draft picks from this class in kind of the middle to late rounds here, because I think there were some really interesting value picks, players that I really liked, where they landed and when they went. And I'm going to start with Nakobe Dean. I know I talked about him a little bit already when we were looking at the Eagles draft here, but getting a player who's able to be this dynamic playmaker on the defensive side of the ball like Dean is, and what we saw him do at Georgia in the 3rd round, I think is fantastic. And the Eagles desperately need an upgrade at linebacker. I said it throughout this entire pre-draft process. I still think they might even need more, but I think that they really found somebody here who's going to be an impact player for them on the defense. Getting somebody like that in the 3rd round is fantastic. Obviously, you hope you can stay healthy. That is a bit of a risk when you take somebody like that when they've got the injury history there. But clearly, Philadelphia feels pretty confident that Dean will be able to get back out in the field and have an impact. In the 3rd round, I love that, and I think it's going to be a need that they end up filling here. And somebody that I can see playing sooner rather than later, really, because of this. If he's healthy and he's able to get out there, he's going to be able to work his way out of the field. Don't be surprised if Nakobe Dean has a pretty impactful rookie season. Let's move on here. Malik Willis. I think this is a fantastic value pick at this point. To me, most upside of any quarterback in this draft class. Taking him in the 3rd round for the Titans was fantastic. And the truth is that Ryan Tannehill is coming down the kind of tail end of his career here, but this is a great spot because Willis is not pro ready yet. I've said that from the very beginning. As much as I love the upside, he is not ready to be an NFL starter right now. There are too many question marks about his pocket awareness, his ability to get rid of the football, and just really understanding how to interpret where the pressure is coming from because he got sacked a ton at Liberty. And some of that's on the offensive line, but a lot of it is on a guy holding onto the ball for too long and not recognizing that he needs to play quicker, especially when you get to the NFL level. So I think giving him a chance to sit for a year or two behind Ryan Tannehill before taking over the starting job would be a fantastic situation for him. Now, this is more of a long-term move for Tennessee, but I think it keeps them at least in the position where they feel like they've got a succession plan now. Because that was something John Robinson, the GM of the Titans, talked about this offseason at the Combine, saying they wanted to find a succession plan. Well, now they have. At least they have somebody in place they can work with and develop and feel like, you know what, in a year or two, this is going to be our guy. Now, only time will tell if that actually works out, but I think finding that guy in the third round, when you look at the physical traits that Malik Willis has when it comes to the athleticism, the mobility, and the arm strength, that's great value right there. You take that every time, and you hope that you can get the most out of him, find some good coaches that are able to work with him and get him up to NFL speed and let him use those physical gifts to be successful at the NFL level. Another one that I touched on a little bit before, and this is the Green Bay Packers taking Sean Rhyan, 92nd overall in the third round. I think he's one of the best interior linemen in this class. I know that I may be alone in that, or maybe at least among the few that feel that way. But he was somebody that played tackle in college at UCLA. He has that ability to do it again in the NFL. He's maybe didn't have the best measurables to be able to do so. That being said, I think having a guard, which is probably what he'll be in the NFL, with the capability of playing tackle is always a good thing. You have that position versatility. And as I mentioned, the Packers have had a lot of injuries in the offensive line. So finding a guy who can line up and play at probably at least 2, maybe 3 or 4 different positions on that offensive line is huge. And I really like the pick overall. I think this is going to be a good thing for Aaron Rodgers. You keep him upright, give him protection. Plus, Ryan's actually a pretty good run blocker as well, which Green Bay really likes to do. So I could see him getting onto the field potentially early on in his NFL career, especially if there's an injury that happens early in the season. I think he's going to be somebody who can fill in that role very nicely and potentially not give it back because that's just how talented he is as a player. All right, let's keep moving here. To start of the 4th round, one of my favorite players, guy that I had on my guys list, if you have been paying attention to that, my draft crushes, whatever you might want to call it, Cade Otton, tight end out of Washington. He lands with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers to start the 4th round. First of all, love the value here at this point. A player that I thought could have gone maybe late 2nd, early 3rd round, instead goes the beginning of the 4th. So getting him a round later than I would have thought already makes me feel good about this pick. And then, of course, there's the fact that Tampa Bay currently doesn't really have much of the tight end position. Cameron Brate's still there, but they lost O.J. Howard this offseason. He ended up going up to Buffalo. And Rob Gronkowski right now is still unclear whether he's going to play again. There was a lot of uncertainty when we've heard from him this offseason about his NFL future. So finding a guy like Cade Otton, who I think is a fantastic blocker with upside as a pass catcher, that's going to fit really well in for what Tampa Bay wants to do. Now, I think that this doesn't mean that Gronk isn't coming back, but they now have a plan in place in case he doesn't and for when he eventually does leave. And so I think Cade Otton is going to help you there. He's not going to be the same physically dominant player as Gronk. Nobody really is. We haven't seen very many, if any, players like Rob Gronkowski in the history of the NFL. So Cade Otton, though, I think is going to be a really solid NFL tight end, and getting that in the 4th round feels like really good value to me. Next one up here, Tariq Woolen, who's a long, athletic corner coming out of UTSA. He ended up going to the Seattle Seahawks in the 5th round. And to me, this feels like just a perfect Seattle pick. They love those big corners on the outside who have the ability to just break up passes, play in zone, and just use that size and length to their advantage. Now, Woolen is definitely a work in progress, but he tested out of his mind at a sub-4 340 at 6'4". Plus, he's got super long arms, looks pretty good on film. There's definitely some stuff he needs to work on. He's still, I feel like, got a long way to go from a technique standpoint, but he does good breaking up the passes and stuff like that. I could see him potentially getting himself on the field pretty early on in his career with Seattle, especially when you look at what they lost this offseason in their defensive backfield. So to me, yeah, Tariq Woolen, this is a fantastic pick for the Seahawks. I love this. I think he's going to be somebody that down the line is going to be an impact starter for them, somebody that you could see really commanding that outside corner. I think that maybe it's a little bit high praise, but we've seen Seattle do this before with some high-level guys. Brandon Browner, Richard Sherman, they've had those big body corners on the outside. They're able to, I think he's got to add a little more muscle to his frame to really be built like those guys, but that's what Seattle is capable of doing when you give them this kind of type of prospect here. I'm not saying he's going to be that, but I think that potential could be there with Tariq Woolen, given the physical attributes. One more that I'm going to throw out here, and that's Matthew Butler. And this was a pick by the Raiders here. I think they needed some depth at defensive tackle, somebody that could come in and be part of that rotation. I think Butler's a really great option. He played well at Tennessee, was impressive in the film that I watched of him. I just had him outside my top 100. He just missed making the cut. They got him at 175th overall, so I love the value there. I think it's a good fit for Las Vegas, somebody that could come in and be part of that rotation there, hopefully help you in the interior of that defensive line. They've got two really good edge rushers right now, obviously Chandler Jones and Max Crosby, so finding somebody who can help you on the interior is going to be a great thing. But those are some of my favorite picks from this draft class. There are plenty more that I can get into. I really liked some of the picks the Panthers made, Brandon Smith, Amari Barno, but there's a couple of different guys too later down the line that I liked, but I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here. Those are some of the ones that I wanted to shout out here though, as the draft is over and we're kind of now reacting to all of it. So like I said, plenty more content coming. I'm excited. I'm working on some player interviews and stuff like that. Hopefully we'll have some stuff coming up this offseason to kind of help tide you over until college football is finally back in August. But yeah, we're going to continue to talk the draft on this podcast. Going to continue to come at you with Friday episodes. So make sure you hit that subscribe button. Continue to check in every Friday for a new show. This is the special Monday podcast, obviously, but this is going to be a one-time thing kind of in the aftermath of this NFL draft. But thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. I really appreciate it. As always, you can follow me on social media. I'm at cmclin84. You can follow The Aftermath on Facebook and on Twitter, Aftermath Sports in both spots. Also, like I said, please don't forget to rate, review, subscribe. Means a ton to me. Also makes it easier for people to find the show, all that type of great stuff. So make sure that you do that. Anywhere you find your podcast, you should be able to find this show at this point. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Anchor, YouTube, Stitcher, you name it, it's there. So thank you again, everybody, for tuning in. You guys will hear from me again next week.